Hello, I'm Bob the Booker and welcome to my channel. I hope everyone's doing really well. Obviously I had to skip last week's weekly reading roundup malarkey extravaganza because I was away and the timings just didn't work out. So this is going to be a little bit of a combo of some books from before and some others. In some ways what makes this a little bit easier is there are some booktube prize books that I read that I can't technically talk about until the prize is all finished. So that in some ways cuts this down from being like 75 books or whatever. But anyway, you may also notice I've got a slightly hoarse voice at the moment. I'm fine. I unfortunately after 2 years have managed, like of 2 years of avoiding it, have managed to test positive for COVID. So hooray, love that for me. This is a great time to be alive. But yeah, I'm fine. I'm just a little bit bunged up and a little bit sleepy, and I probably will go and have a nap after this. But nice to be back doing this, and I feel very, very fortunate that I can kind of just rest up. Anyway, so let's get started with some of the books that I've read over the last couple of weeks, but mostly the ones from the last week or so. I don't think I really spoke about it much before. I think I said that I was planning on reading it, but Daryl by Jackie Ess is a book that I read alongside the wonderful Leo Bancroft. Leo did not necessarily always get on with this. I didn't always, but actually overall I really loved this. This is the idea... I'll just read out the blurb because I feel like this... Actually, no, I won't. I'll just try and vaguely describe this. It's a bit of a weird book. Essentially, Daryl is the idea of a man who essentially enjoys his wife being with other men, and it's sort of his own sort of a delve into his psyche as he goes through. This book is kind of wild and I kind of love it. Like I really appreciate when books do things that other books haven't done before, and this very much feels like one of those, but it is a bit of a ride, and yeah, it's a whole thing. So there we go. Next, I've been reading a few books from the the Republic of Consciousness prize. My brain is doing great, and you know, as much as I want to blame this on sort of COVID brain fog, most of this is just that my brain just doesn't work anyway, so who can tell any difference really? But I've been reading a few of the books from both the International Booker Prize list and the Republic of Consciousness list. And the Republic of Consciousness is for independent presses and small presses, and they've just released their short list, but I'm still sort of reading through bits of the long list, so I'll talk a little bit about those. I've read a couple of them before, so this is me just sort of finishing off a few towards the end. But we have The Beasts They Turned Away by Ryan Dennis, which is a really quite brutal and horrific book in many, many ways, but I think just so beautifully done, which is looking at a kind of a set of characters around a farm, and particularly some of the very like life and death and brutal parts of that, and I'm underselling that massively because it does deal a lot with, for example, violence, and particularly things like violence against animals and how that's normally quite an early sign of psychopaths essentially, and sociopaths, and it kind of essentially examines violence through this, as in lots of violence is meted out against cows or against sort of other creatures, but particularly cows, and that sort of is a bit of a sign that, you know, sort of toxic, well, not even toxic masculinity, just that sort of characters have sort of been almost trained to see violence as one of the only options. Really, really beautiful and interesting book. Doesn't sound like it from what I just said. Is really impactful and powerful in its own way as well. Also on that list, I won't go into too much detail on these because I'm going to do a proper long list run through, but it was also The Song of Youth by Montserrat Roig, translated from Catalan, I believe, and this is a set of short stories that looks at various relationships between characters, and particularly women and sort of women's roles in society and how that's changed. So some really interesting ones. Some short stories that I was less keen on and just sort of didn't find myself that drawn into, but was still really interesting to read. And reading books by small presses is always quite interesting just because there are so many exciting different things that you wouldn't normally expect. So really glad to have checked this out. And also finally, In the Dark which is also on that same long list, by Anamaria Crowe Serrano, which is about the Spanish Civil War, and was also quite a powerful read, if quite brutal. And it's one of the, it's funny, this is basically about 300 pages, is one of the longest on the long list. But then you realise that like the pages are sort of a bit like this, where there's quite a lot of like spacing. But anyway, it's a very, very short to long list in that sense. Like all of the books are fairly short, so I've been really enjoying just going through, and I've still got a couple more I think to go, and then I will have read them. And I don't that seems like such a pain. Once I have read them all, I will have read them all. Well done, Bob, doing a great job as always. Anyway, I also listened to an audiobook of Our Bodies, Their Battlefields by Christina Lamb, and she is a journalist who's covered sort of quite a lot of, she's done quite a lot of reporting around war zones, so you can probably expect, based on that and the title of this book, it was not a cheerful read, but a really powerful and insightful one. So essentially it looks a lot at violence against women and girls, and particularly that in wartime. And so she talks through some quite harrowing moments of sort of just absolutely vile abuse being perpetrated against women and girls, and occasionally men as well, but sort of there is a very strong gendered element to this. And it was a really heartbreaking book to read. I was at one point listening to it as an audiobook and just sort of walking around, and just some of the scenes that she depicts are just absolutely heartbreaking. One of the most incredible things I've read or listened to, but not the easiest. And so in some ways, having it as an audiobook makes it easier because you can kind of focus on, well, not focus on other things, but you know, you can kind of sort of contextualize it a little bit more. In some ways it makes it worse because you're just sort of walking and, you know, having quite a nice day and listening to someone just talk about some of the most despicable acts against people. Yeah, not the easiest book to listen to or read, but I think a really incredibly powerful one. And she's done her research. This is a really well thought out book, and she manages to maintain a lot of humanity and a lot of warmth towards people in this book who have had the absolute worst things happen to them. And I think I was put onto this book by Gunpowder Fiction and Plot, and yeah, they had a similar reaction of just, oh gosh, wow, that was, yeah, it's one of those, but a really important book, I think, nonetheless. Next up, I read Show Me Yours by Lawrence Windrush, which is a relatively short sort of memoir autobiography, sort of going through sort of a young boy's life as he sort of grows into adulthood. And it was really a funny and quite interesting read. I thought there was a lot of, what's the word? My brain is not working. There were a lot of kind of mischievous things happening, a lot of like really silly, kind of set pieces of sort of things that happened in his life, whether that's kind of dealing with, you know, sort of schoolboy pranks or like various other things, or sort of sexual awakenings, or all of those sorts of other things. So a really interesting and sort of fun short book. And yeah, it was sort of just nice because I was reading this while I was just sort of on, you know, last weekend while I was on holiday and sort of away with friends. And it was the sort of perfect thing to sort of just sit and read in the morning, and just sort of, you know, nothing too weighty, just sort of something I can sort of sit and enjoy. And it was really, yeah, really fun to read. So that was that one. And then I read a couple more books just over the last couple of days. So obviously COVID brain and just generally has sort of somewhat slowed down my reading in the last few days, partly because I was incredibly busy with lots of work stuff, and then suddenly was like, yeah, more stuff's not going to happen right now. My brain is fried. So I have read a few other books, which were all sort of these. I had a sort of trio of 5-star reads to sort of end the month. Well, and in the month, yeah, and end this week. I'm rambling. Let me talk about the books. First up was Schwett by Claire Oshetsky, and I heard so many good things about this at the end of last year. Essentially, it's the story of a woman who gives birth. Well, she is convinced that she's going to give birth to what she calls an owl baby. Owl as in the creature here, right? Like, so I'm realizing with my sort of bunged upness, I'm not sure if the word owl is coming across as anything apart from just like a grunt. So anyway, she is convinced that she's going to have an owl baby, and she and her husband are sort of their wits' end, essentially. And essentially what transpires with this book is we're sort of learnt to really distrust her as a narrator in some ways. Not fully. There's a lot that she gives us insights into that's really quite profound and interesting. But at the same time, she is one of everyone around her seemingly thinks that she is doing all the wrong things, that she's harming her kid. And actually, increasingly, as we go through the story, we realise that her instincts to protect this owl baby seem to be at odds with not only everybody else around her, but seemingly at times at odds with the baby. So, we get these descriptions of her feeding the kid like these little like mice or bits of raw meat because it's an owl and that's what they eat. And everyone around them but that nobody really seems to almost contextualize it like that. Everybody else almost seems to sort of read it as if she's just sort of feeding it normally, almost. And so eventually, as you kind of go through, we start to get this idea that there's a bit more going on, that potentially the kid, this child who everyone else calls Charlotte instead of Schwett, which again is a hint that maybe our narrator is sort of has something wrong, sort of is misunderstanding everything around her or is willfully doing so. We sort of start to realize that maybe this girl Chouette has some kind of developmental disorder of some sort, because characters around seem to be wanting to fix this character, to fix this young girl, Charlotte. And the way they fix her seems to at first be quite off-putting. And again, we're only really told this through the perspective of the narrator, who we know at times is somewhat not trustworthy. And what's then fascinating is we're like, is this kind of character, is Charlotte in being fixed, has she become so sort of robotic because that's actually the kind of what's actually happened, or does she just seem robotic to her mother, who we're hearing everything through? And so I thought this book was really staggering, and I don't think I've really read much like this. It reminded me a little bit in some ways of Night Bitch on a slightly different side, in the sense of this idea of sort of returning to a really feral kind of sense of humanity, of sort of stripping away anything about being human and being an animal with sort of instincts and drives, which I thought was really interesting. But yeah, just a really remarkable book, and nothing like I'd really read before. It's really hard to kind of, even with my sort of COVID-y brain, I was tearing through this, and the fact that I was able to concentrate on it was quite remarkable for me. So really, really loved this, and I thought it was incredibly powerful. Next, I read Paul Baker's Outrageous, which is a non-fiction book looking at Section 28 in the UK. And so a quick bit of backstory on both of those things. So Paul Baker is a writer who he sort of does a lot of sort of academic work, particularly around linguistics, which is actually how I first encountered him. He basically saved me during my dissertation when I was writing about queer slang. He does a lot of research into Polari, sort of like a kind of code language in sort of some ways. I was doing it in not enough justice, but a sort of code language used by particularly gay men, but other people as well. Sort of in sort of 50s, 60s, and sort of other times as well. And so that's that. And Section 28 was a law that was passed in the UK in, I believe it was the 70s. I should know, I literally have just read this book. But that was passed, in the 80s. It's literally in the title, in the thing of this book. Anyway, it was passed in the 80s, and this meant that the law was then that local councils or local authorities could not promote homosexuality. Now, the language of that obviously feels a bit bizarre, and the idea of promoting homosexuality is quite a bizarre thing anyhow, but that's exactly the problem. It was interpreted so differently by so many schools, by so many places. I grew up during the time of Section 28. I was at school before it was repealed, and so as a result, there was a whole generation of teachers and sort of several generations of teachers who did not talk about anything to do with LGBTQ people for fear of losing their jobs, because they thought that it was a kind of a blanket ban, and the wording was so vague that it almost could be that. And so I think what's so brilliant about this book, to go back to the actual book itself, is how well Paul Baker not only frames out the history of how this bill came to pass, the people who then fought it, and then what happened after it was repealed. He also sort of injects quite a lot of humour into this. There's a lot of absurdity in this situation. There were all these brilliantly theatrical and camp moments that were no less radical for that, such as a group of queer women who abseiled down into the houses of into Parliament during a debate, just to kind of make their voices heard. There were a group of queer women who also stormed the BBC during a news broadcast once, just to be able to make their voices known. So actually, there's what I think is really brilliant about this book is it really does talk about those people who put everything on the line to make sure that that others were free, but also really acknowledges that there's a lot of sort of fun and vibrancy within the queer community, and that particularly showed during this time as well, which is really quite beautiful. And last but definitely not least, we have The Colony by Audrey McGee, and I have just finished this very recently and absolutely loved this. So Eric Carl Anderson over at Lonesome Reader kindly gave me this copy, and I've just been really enjoying it. It's essentially about sort of two artists who go to an island in Ireland, and are kind of wanting to sort of paint local things in the local area and sort of see things, but it very quickly becomes more of a discussion around British and Irish relationships, and Britain and Ireland have had a complicated history, and I say that acknowledging that it's Britain making things complicated here, and that's the sort of part of the duality of this title, right? There is an artist's colony, which is the thing that this book sort of hinges around, but also the colony, Ireland as a colony of Britain. And particularly how that all plays out, because, for example, one of the people on this island is a linguist, and this linguist is tracking sort of Irish Gaelic being spoken on the island. This is hard to do. Ireland. And he's tracking the use of this language on the island, noting that it's very likely that it's going to go extinct, at least within the island. And so there's this real feeling of what is a nation, what is an identity, what is a culture, and how does language interact with that? Because some characters in the book are sort of Irish and English bilinguals, and so they don't really care. They're sort of like, well, I use both, it's all fine. Some of them don't use Irish, some of them only use Irish. But you get this really interesting thing with some Irish characters saying, but what does it matter? Take away Irish from us. We still have a rich and unique culture and history and everything else. We're still a people. We don't need this language to make that. Whereas you get other arguments the other side, which really appeals to me as someone who genuinely really loves debates around language and things like this. I really love particularly things around endangered minority languages, and this is sort of massively appeals to me on that. But actually, I think what was also really clever about this book is not only by kind of positioning it through having outsiders in the form of painters, who obviously are trying to capture what's in front of them in a very specific moment of time, but have the power to shift it and to kind of see it very much through their own lens, is you also have interspersed with this historical moments, or sort of almost newspaper cuttings of things that have happened as a result of some of these tensions. So we get a lot of references to the IRA and to bombings and to innocent people being caught in the crossfire. And all of that kind of runs alongside this in a way that's quite bizarre, because you're watching a painter, you kind of think, well, what is there really about two painters being on an island and being around some people, and this whole British-Irish thing, it's quite a relatively small thing. But then actually how it plays out, we then see the sort of historical ramifications of this when it has sort of been tricky, we see then resistance movements, you know, like the IRA or whatever else. We see violence, we see harm being caused, and it's kind of shocking because that seems very, very different from just an academic discussion about a language being used. So I think that's this book's real strength, and just so powerfully written, and I absolutely loved this. I mean, I think it's just come out. So really, really excited to see more of this book kind of being out and around in the world. Anyway, I believe those are all the books I read over the last week and a bit. Who knows? I can't see any others on this list. Anyway, I've been Bob, the Bookerette. Thank you for listening, and apologies for this croaky voice all the way through, and for my even hazier than usual delivery. I'm going to go and take a nap. I've been Bob, the Bookerette. Take care and speak to you all soon. Hope you're looking after yourselves. Bye-bye.